Let me first say how pleased I am to be here. And I've spent many an hour listening to all of you from IFPRI as a board member. So now you have to listen to me. That's the trade-off. And let me also say Human Development and Capability Association, before I forget. I'll be in good with all of them if I tell you what it is. It's an association of academics and policymakers and NGOs and so on, basically to advance the view that human development and capabilities, Sen's view about development, is a very important way of looking at things. And we have discussion groups and seminars and annual conferences in which we write papers on these issues. And we even have a journal called the Journal of Human Development and Capability. So please, if any of you are interested, look it up on the website and join us. Okay, horizontal inequalities and peace. This is a wonderful quotation from de Tocqueville. If ever you work on anything, you will find that there is a quotation probably from de Tocqueville which says what you want to say. And basically, he says that when you have conflict, it's nearly always at the bottom of it all something about inequality. And it's not only that the poor are resenting the rich, but it's also sometimes and quite often the rich who are resenting the poor. And that really sums up a lot of what I'm going to say, so it's a wonderful quotation. So I just look very briefly at the nature of conflict today, and then I'm going to come on to the main topic, which is the role of horizontal inequalities. Well, recent wars have been mainly intranational, not international, and they've been heaviest among low-income countries. And, of course, that they are themselves, as Rajul said, an important cause of lower growth and poverty and stagnation and so on. So that's, in fact, I came to this topic because I was working on the very first Human Development Report, and I looked at the countries at the bottom to see, what can we say about the ones who are worst on human development. And I found that 80-90% of them were actually in war or had been in war very recently. And it was obvious there was something going on. And at that point, we just said, well, we understand that. And we put them to one side and started talking about the others. And I then felt that wasn't the right way to deal with the very poorest countries. So I then returned to them. What is the causes and consequences of conflict? At the moment, conflict's highest in Africa, the heaviest incidents. But that's not always been so. And, of course, there are some very important non-African conflicts. And the deaths are far the greatest among the civilians, which makes... and probably about 90%, it makes them, in a way, particularly costly. The fact that the civilians are either targeted directly or suffer from the indirect consequences through famine, lack of health services, and so on. The number of wars have been rising, but in fact, since about the mid-90s, they've started to fall, which is very good news. Some people... maybe it's the end of the Cold War, and maybe it's the much more active international interventions, which, of course, go along with the end of the Cold War. But despite the fall, the proportion of conflicts which are presented as ethnic, that doesn't mean they're very different necessarily from the ones before, but they are presented as ethnic, the proportion being presented as ethnic has been rising. So here you see that there's a definite peak around the mid-1990s and some decline since then. And here you see that there's been a trend rise in the proportion of conflicts which appear to be ethnic. Now let me now turn then to the main topic. What's the causes of these conflicts? And there's a big dichotomy between those who say it's all about culture and those who say it's all about the economy. Huntington is famous for saying there's a clash of civilizations, there's not much we can do about it. People can't live together, you just have to separate them. Well, that's not very helpful, given, as Rajul said at the beginning, how many societies have got multi-ethnic citizens. And the more migration there is, the more multi-ethnicity we have. But also, it's nonsense, because if you look at the total number of people who are living side by side of different ethnicities and religions, and then look at the proportion in conflict, it's tiny, the proportion in conflict. In fact... Fearon and Leighton said that in Africa it was less than 0.01% of all the possible, if you take all the multi-ethnic situations. So clearly it's not just people are different and they can't live together. Something else is going on. In addition to which, and I'll be coming back to this, ethnicity is not really something just which is out there and unchangeable, but it's something socially constructed. In fact, pre-colonial ethnicities were very vague, and in Africa at least, and have been delimited and defined by colonialism and by subsequent events. But even so, they remain socially constructed, fluid, and so on. So we need to turn beyond culture to other things, and people have looked at the socioeconomic causes, and very briefly, there's the rationalist view, which was very popular a few years ago. Basically, it's individuals maximizing, as usual, the rational economic man, but maximizing by fighting rather than by doing economic activities, because if they fight, they can loot, they get employment, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a sort of fundamental flaw in that, because, well, two flaws. One is that most conflicts are among organized groups. And if it's just a matter of individuals maximizing, you can understand criminality, but it's more difficult to understand conflict. Why do they form groups? What motivates them? And the other obvious weakness is that a lot of people die for their cause, and they clearly get worse off rather than better off in the process of the conflict. And so you can hardly say that that's the sufficient explanation. Now, I'm not saying that people don't have individual motives when they fight. Of course they do. And so, of course, people who join the American army are thinking about their education, all sorts of things. People always have their individual reasons for doing things, but there are other things as well. Well, a second explanation is that the social contract is broken. We all have some implicit, that's the sort of Rousseauian concept, we all have an implicit social contract with the state. The state will provide security and certain services, we will be obedient to the state. But if the state fails to provide those services, fails to provide security, then the social contract's broken. People no longer feel a sense of obligation to obey the state. Again, there isn't very systematic evidence on that, but there's certainly something in it. Well, then we've had the hypothesis that there's green war. It's sort of pressures of the environment cause people to take to conflict. And again, I would say there's something in that. But obviously there are many cases where there's no particular pressures, and indeed many conflicts take place where there's resource abundance rather than resource poverty, in the sense that it's very high-value resources rather than you're up against lack of water or lack of land. And in fact, a lot of people have been predicting water wars would become very important as water becomes more scarce. But in fact, the evidence suggests that people sort these sorts of conflicts out without violence. So let me now come to my hypothesis, or the central one of our group, which is that the real problem is group inequalities, or horizontal inequalities. Inequalities between groups, that's what horizontal inequalities mean. Now, most economists measure and evaluate inequality in what I'll call vertical inequality, in the sense that it's among individuals. You line all the individuals up in a society or the households, and you get your Gini coefficient, and that's your measure of inequality. And if you look at that in relation to conflict, you don't find any particular evidence that there are societies which are more unequal have more conflict. On the other hand, if you think about it and look at horizontal inequalities, or inequalities between groups, you do find evidence, and I shall come on to say more about that where there is significant group inequalities, horizontal inequalities, you are more likely to have conflict. So, obviously, the first question is which groups? And the easy answer is groups with meaning to members. They're viewed as important to the people themselves and as important to others, an aspect of identity. There are many salient identities. When we look around the world at the political entities, we find in Africa that ethnicity is important, and religion. We find religion is important in many regions of the world and behind many conflicts. Race important in some places. Region, which overlaps with religion and overlaps with ethnicity very often. And then in South Asia we have caste, which hasn't really been a systematic organizing identity as far as conflict is concerned, but is out there as an important identity. And then there is class. Actually, the identities which make people mobilize politically are not necessarily the ones that they think of as most important. And we did some research asking people, what is most important to you as a person in terms of your identity. And we gave them a list of possibilities and also open-ended questions. And the answer came in West Africa, religion was primarily important, and that they wouldn't like their children to marry across religions, they don't socialize much with people across religions, for themselves and their sense of who they are, religion came top. Ethnicity came quite low down. It was a bit difficult to capture because we had language too, but still it was not very important. I think gender, in most cases, was more important to people than ethnicity. And yet, in West Africa, in politics, ethnicity seems to be the mobilizing factor. So why is that? And I think we got a clue to that when we asked people, how do you think the government allocates resources? Do they discriminate against particular groups according to religion? And they said, no, they don't. And, well, gender they probably thought they did. But when it came to ethnicity, they said yes. They did think that the government used ethnicity as a political element. So it's not, in a sense, the ethnicity which mobilizes people is the one that's used politically more than the one that is sort of intrinsically important to people. Of course, I've already talked a bit about the nature of identities, and when we divide people into groups, we're assuming that they are rather sharply divided into different identity groups. Now, these are not just plucked from the air. If I divided this room into two, this side and that side, you wouldn't necessarily immediately acquire a sort of strong identity. You might have to have some other difference between you, such as that there's only food on that side and no food on this side, or some other such difference. Incidentally, they have done experiments with children, dividing them into two groups, the blues and the reds, and managed to get battles between the children going within about half an hour. So you can acquire an identity quite quickly. But still, we know they're relatively fluid, and the point is that they become important when people mobilize them, when there are leaders who accentuate them, the media who accentuates them, mobilize them politically. So the salient groups then depend very critically on leadership, and it may be the leadership chooses particular group boundaries in order to get a powerful winning coalition, as Posner puts it. And even though these groups have been in a way constructed or at least accentuated by leaders in getting to mobilize people, nonetheless, when it comes to fighting, they are really believed by the participants. And of course, as the fights go on, they're believed more and more. And indeed, some people, I think wrongly, think that really ethnicity doesn't matter much till after the war. It's during the war that the ethnic divisions are created. I think that's wrong. They're there latently before. But still, there is a point that they get accentuated by conflict. And if ever you read anything about Serbo-Croat issues, you will find that people were only conscious really of the big distinction after the fighting began. Okay, well, coming back to horizontal inequalities, important issue is that they're multidimensional. And four very important dimensions: politics, political power, are hugely important if groups are included in political power or excluded. And not just at the government level, at the top, but also in the military, in the police, and so on. Economic resources, and not just incomes, but employment, which is very visible to people if there's unfairness in employment, land, and so on. And then social aspects like housing, water, education, and so on. And finally, cultural recognition, because groups, by definition, these groups are cultural groups. And if your religion or your culture is not recognized by society and is discriminated against by society, that can be very conflictual. Now, in every case you have these four dimensions, but which particular element within them is important will vary across societies. Like Northern Ireland, housing was a big issue, but it's not an issue in the Congo, for example, at all. But on the other hand, land is very important, say, in Zimbabwe, and was not an issue in Northern Ireland. It depends on the nature of your economy and what assets are important and what assets are not. But politics is nearly always important, employment is nearly always important, and so on. So let me come then to why horizontal inequalities are a powerful mobilizing agent. First of all, going back to what I said earlier, I said there are those people who think it's all about culture and those people who think it's all about the economy. What horizontal inequalities does in a way is bring culture and the economy together, because it's a question of a cultural identity which binds the group and an economic and political inequality which causes people to feel resentment. And the resentment is felt differently by the potential leaders and the potential followers in any group. The leaders are particularly motivated by exclusion from political power. The followers are particularly motivated by exclusion from the economic resources that they find are important to them. And so what you find is an explosive situation if the leaders are excluded from political power and the followers are excluded from economic and social assets. And then cultural discrimination operates both on the leaders and on the followers. So we find the mobilization is greatest when you have these both leaders and followers motivated in this way. And I could illustrate this with a recent case in Kenya, where there had been horizontal inequalities in economic terms for a long time. But politically, most of the groups had either been in government or the more deprived group was in government and the more privileged group was out of government. And indeed, when Kibaki first got power, he came under a rainbow coalition, which included everybody in government. But after a couple of years, he, for various reasons, excluded the groups who were also economically deprived. Well, that was provocative enough. But then you have an election in which those groups believe, I think correctly, that they won, and then they were told they lost. And you have got very strong political exclusion, and that became the provocative issue in terms of creating a conflict. But when you only had the socio-economic conflict, you had the potential there, but you didn't have the actual conflict. And we have other cases like that. Well, here are many examples where you can see that in each of these cases there were sharp horizontal inequalities, in each of these cases associated with the conflict. Some of the cases have been written up as detailed cases and others not. And this is just to show you that very different assets and social services and so on are important in different areas. But what I've said before so far doesn't really prove anything. I mean, we can never totally prove anything, but I can give you a lot of examples, but then you can give me a lot of counter-examples. So we need to be a bit more systematic than that. And that's what we've been trying to do in my centre. We've been basically investigating this hypothesis. And I want to now quickly run through the main conclusions. We were looking at 3 regions and 8 countries. West Africa, we were comparing Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia. And Latin America, Bolivia, Guatemala, and Peru. And in each of those cases, one country has avoided conflict, Ghana, Malaysia, and Bolivia, and the others have had conflict. So they were chosen in that way. In all the countries, there were large socio-economic horizontal inequalities. So that's not the differentiating factor in this case. You don't need to look at all the detail, but I assure you they're pretty bad in each of the cases. So let me now come to our findings. The first finding is that we did indeed find that the probability of conflict rises as socio-economic horizontal inequalities increase. And for that, we had used econometric evidence so that we could look at the counterexamples as well as the examples. And there's cross-country evidence which is being collected by Ostby, Gudrun Ostby, some previous evidence by Gerd, although he uses somewhat different definitions, some previous evidence in Africa by Barrows, who came across this finding. He wasn't, in fact, looking for it at all, but that was his finding. Then we've also looked within country at, and evidence produced by Luca Mancini in our own group on Indonesia showed that conflict was higher in the districts with the higher horizontal inequalities. And then Gates and Morshed did similar work in Nepal. And then Brown, again, he's one of our members, looked at separatist violence and found that the countries where the regions had the highest horizontal inequality vis-a-vis the rest of the country were most likely to be in conflict. And incidentally, the regions could be either richer than the rest of the country or poorer. It wasn't only, well, obviously you see the richer ones have the motive of leaving because they can take their wealth with them, like Biafra. And then the poorer ones' motive is that they feel they're getting a bad deal and that they might get a better deal if they were independent. Second, we found what I really was saying earlier, that conflict was more likely where the political and socio-economic horizontal inequalities are consistent. You have situations in which, you know, the deprived group forms the majority and therefore is in political power in a democratic system, like in Malaysia, or in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, the northerners tend to be in political power. And then the privileged group is another one. And then the privileged group, they're doing okay economically, so they're less likely to take to conflict. But it's where they're more consistent, where they're both in the same direction, that you get more likely to get conflict. And again, there's some econometric evidence produced by OSPI on this. And then Siedemann and Wimmer have done some interesting analysis simply looking at political exclusion. They don't look at the socioeconomic, but they find strong evidence on that. And if we think about examples, well, I already quoted the example of Kenya, but Cote d'Ivoire is very similar, that they'd had sharp horizontal inequalities in the economics between North and South for many years. But under Houphouët-Boigny, they had a basically inclusive government, but then subsequently they became very exclusionary, excluded the North, and you had the very bad conflict breaking out, and it was quite explicitly based on the inequalities. I mean, the Charte du Nord, which was the charter of the Northerners, actually said, well, look, we're poorer, our culture's not respected, our religion's not respected, and so on. So they were using that to mobilize, and of course political exclusion was the fundamental, was also a fundamental motive. And incidentally, what's interesting, in a couple of towns in Nigeria, we found a situation where you had political exclusion but not economic exclusion, and the leaders did try and motivate people to have a conflict, but they were not ready to be mobilized in the area where there wasn't economic exclusion. So you really need both if you're going to get a conflict. Well, then we found that, which is the obverse of all this, that if you have inclusive government, for example, through PR and federalism, you tend to reduce the likelihood of conflict. Citizenship is a very important source of exclusion because it confers so many different rights, and that was therefore not conferring citizenship or excluding people from citizenship as an important element in conflict. I've already talked about the importance of cultural status inequalities. Not only do they cause resentment if you don't recognize a language, but they're also a source of other inequalities. So if you think about Sri Lanka, their language policy, which was to say the official language Sinhalese, automatically excluded the Tamils from a great number of government jobs. So it was that as much as the language itself, which caused huge amounts of resentment. And of course, cultural events can very often trigger the conflict, as we know. Well, perceptions, this is pretty obvious, but you know, what matters when people take action is how they perceive things as much as what actually happens. And I mean, we assume there's some relationship between them, but not necessarily all that much. For example, in our surveys, people perceived big differences in access to government jobs and contracts, but they didn't perceive big differences in education. But there were huge differences in education. So they don't, perceptions aren't necessarily attuned with reality. And we found in Nigeria, where there are broadly the same horizontal inequalities as in Ghana, people would generally perceive themselves as more ethnic, less national, and facing sharper inequalities. Well, we found that natural resources can be an important source of horizontal inequalities. Natural resources are known to be, where you have a lot of high-value natural resources, I should say, like oil, it's known to increase the incidence of conflict, but it's less well known why. And one of the reasons is that it tends to come into one region of the country and be dominated by one region, and then the rest of the country resents it. So it's a source of horizontal inequality. Or the government manages to take it away from that region, give it to everybody else, and then the people where it's taken away from resent it. So it's a very difficult situation to handle. And the worst is what we observed in Indonesia and Nigeria, where you in fact take away all the resources and leave the people where it is found actually poorer than the rest of the country. Well, the nature of the state is very important. in determining whether horizontal inequalities actually lead to conflict, because you can have accommodating states who try and solve things, and you can have states which make things worse. And in our cases, Guatemala and Indonesia for many years were actually prosecuting the war. They were making it much worse, whereas in Ghana, and in Bolivia really, they tried to accommodate people when there was problems. We found that horizontal inequalities are very persistent, and that's important because from a policy point of view, it indicates how difficult it is to handle them. They often lasted centuries. I mean, this is an example of Ghana where horizontal inequalities and infant mortality are worse 1993 than 1931. You know, infant mortality has improved over these years a lot, but the inequalities have remained. And here is one of the reasons, in a way, that education and it is much less accessible to the indigenous people. There's less quantity, and the returns to education are worse because of discrimination and because of lack of good social networks. So this is a reason why people get trapped in a particular group in centuries of poverty. So you see that indigenous people in Latin America, it's not just today. There's a very good book been written, one of our group has written on Peru, showing how the indigenous people have been exploited over the years, over the centuries. It's not just a current problem. Well, having said this then, if you believe the message, so to speak, then it seems important that there should be policies to correct horizontal inequalities. And not only, and I'd like to emphasize this, not only in countries coming out of conflict. In fact, this message is sort of being picked up in a way by the conflict people, but not by the development people. And really it's as important to talk about development being inclusive and not creating inequalities and addressing them where they're there, because then you're doing it a long time ahead. That's your preventative policy. Wait till there's a conflict and things are already very difficult. If you do look at development policies, you will see that horizontal inequalities are not a consideration. For example, aid often worsens them. We have a number of case studies because not deliberately, but it goes to the group who's in power and they distribute it and they are already got more skills, so they're going to use it more effectively and so on. Structural adjustment policies ignore the issue and in practice mainly often make them worse. Occasionally they make them better. They're ignored in most PRSPs and also in political conditionality, where the emphasis tends to be towards elections and multi-party democracy. But elections and multi-party democracy do not allow for this. And that's one of the problems about our model of democracy today. Because you have a democracy with one group who's a majority, and if it's an ethnic group, there'll be a majority not just this year, but next year too, and go on and on. You take Northern Ireland. The problem was the Protestants were majority and Catholics minority, and that wasn't going to change. Well, gradually the Catholics are having larger families, but, it takes a long time. And now they're catching up. They're not having larger families anymore, but that's another matter. But what that means is that if you have an election, you're in a permanent minority, and then that's not acceptable. And so you need to think about structuring democracy in such a way that it's inclusive. Now, the interesting thing is that these policies are included much more in national policies. And everything I have to say about policy comes from national policies. This doesn't come from an invention on our part. But looking at national policies, because countries have to deal with these issues. And we found 3 types of policy which apply really across the board, whether you're talking about politics or economics. First of all, direct policies, which are policies which are targeted to particular groups. So in terms of economics, it's sort of affirmative action. Particular groups get access because of who they are. They can be very effective, and they're also very visible, and visibility has advantages. The group who've been suffering sees that something's being done about them. It also has disadvantages. The group that's not suffering sees that something's happening, and that can make for political problems. So they can lead to strong opposition, and they can entrench the ethnicity. So if you wanted to get away from a group and a country being organised ethnically, this is not the way to go. This is in a way the Belgian way to go, and they still have sharp divisions in Belgium after doing this for a very long time, and similar in Switzerland. So if you wanted to dissolve the differences, this isn't the way to go. On the other hand, it is a very good short-term policy. I could illustrate it in Nigeria, where they have introduced a federal character principle into their politics in such a way that people acknowledge that it's a fair system. It's been hugely important in preventing a recurrence of civil war. But it has also entrenched ethnicity, there's no question. Then there are indirect policies, which in a way sound much more attractive because you design a system in such a way that it will help to close the group differences without actually naming any groups. For example, you have comprehensive primary education or comprehensive secondary education, automatically you've reduced or eliminated the differences in access to secondary education. Or you have progressive taxation, or you have really good regional policy. All these are very good policies in themselves and correct group inequalities. So they're very useful, but they can be much slower to work. And then finally, there's a policy set which sounds most attractive. Let's all be one sort of happy family, dissolve the differences, and become a single identity. Now, some people would say that's not desirable because there's a big debate between, multiculturalism. Do people want to lose their cultures? No. So there's a problem there. But aside from that, it's a very long-term policy, and it's often used to conceal difference rather than actually to cure it. This became very clear to us when we worked in Peru. Initially in Peru, our partners said that there was no difference between people in Peru, and everyone's mestizo, everyone is mixed. That's the national sort of belief, the discourse. But when we got underneath it, first of all, we found huge inequalities between indigenous people and others. I showed you some of the educational ones. And secondly, when we asked people about racism, we found huge consciousness of racism and discrimination and I don't know what. So integration policies are fine, but not if they're being used to conceal difference rather than genuinely bring people together. I think integration, incidentally, policies are very important to accompany the other policies. Now, how many minutes have I got?
5 minutes.
Okay, fine. So I'm not going to say very much about the details of policies. Just on the political horizontal inequalities, between direct and indirect, you may, those of you who are familiar with the literature will recognize a debate between Lippert and Horowitz. Lippert consociate, I can never pronounce that word, nor can anybody else, but you bringing people together and deliberately having the elites all in government. That is, and very explicitly doing it, that is a much more direct policy. Horowitz says you shouldn't do it that way. You should design the political system in such a way that that's the outcome, but not build it in because it entrenches ethnicity. And so that's the big debate, and how effective can you be if you don't use explicit policies? So there are a whole lot of indirect ways, and there are a whole lot of direct ways which have been tried in many places and quite often quite effectively all over the world. Then on the socio-economic horizontal inequalities, you have legal rights, anti-discrimination on the indirect side, progressive taxes, I've talked about some of these. And then the direct side, many countries have put in quotas and targets on assets, employment, subsidies, government procurement. So I want to talk about two cases which, let me just say, on the integrationist policies, there's education policies, whether children are educated in separate schools or together, whether the national curriculum tries to teach respect for other people's culture and then an overarching culture or not, what are the national symbols. And then the media is very important. And incidentally, we can talk about the positive policies, but maybe more importantly is to do something about the negative policies. How far do you allow the media to denigrate people? And I think people have made, there are, at least in my own country, and I'm sure in others, real attempts to try and reduce the negative, if not very much in terms of promoting the positive, but reducing the negative is very important. So two successful cases in terms of horizontal inequalities. First of all, Malaysia. There were riots in the late 60s and then against the Chinese. And there was then a national consensus that something should be done about it. The Chinese, a big minority, 30% or so, much richer than the rest of the country. And it was felt that there should be a deliberate attempt to try and correct the huge inequalities which were inherited from colonial times. And it was really, there were a lot of policies, many of them very direct, with targets and so on and so forth. And pretty successful, not totally, but pretty, because what you see from this is the gap between the pale blue and the reddish colour. The reddish colour are the Chinese, and the pale blue is the Bumiputera, who are the Malays. And the gap has certainly closed hugely if you look from 70 to 2004. But still there's a gap there. But at the same time, this is a 40-year period, really. Now we're talking about a 40-year period. The policies are beginning to cause huge resentment among the Chinese. It's a huge and alive debate. We tried to hold a conference in Malaysia on this issue, and we weren't even able to find a venue. We had to go to Singapore to have the conference. And then we did bring, and it was our most lively conference, but a really very lively debate going on, and huge amounts of criticism, particularly from the Chinese, about it. Well, to me, the other negative thing is that when we did our surveys, we found very little integration between the communities. Now, maybe there was very little before, because we were coming in at the end, but it certainly had not caused a great deal of integration. There was more integration in the urban areas, which was heartening, because in a way the policies have been most effective in the urban areas and least integration in the rural areas. But it did suggest that no integration policies have been undertaken at all, and it suggests to me that you should time limit direct policies of this kind. And I think in the US too, the affirmative action policies were very effective initially and then began to arouse a lot of resentment. And of course, it's a great matter of debate now as to whether they should continue. Well, you can see from this one that really it wasn't very successful on the asset front. So, I mean, the Chinese are not on a very strong wicket saying that they've been very discriminated against. But Northern Ireland is very interesting, particularly to me because it's part of our own country, my own country. There are very, very severe horizontal inequalities over centuries between the Catholics and Protestants in politics, economics, education, housing, everything. And then from about the late 70s, quiet policies, very deliberate to correct them, particularly focused on employment and anti-discrimination law, backed up by government purchasing, which only went to firms that respected anti-discrimination. And the result has been quite remarkable. This is, and I apologise that I haven't brought it right up to date, but there's a real problem about bringing it up to date because there's so many Catholics migrating from Eastern Europe into Northern Ireland that if you look at the data now, you pick them up and you haven't necessarily got the old Catholics, so to speak. But this is what happened between the 70s and the 90s. And if the nearer you reach one, the nearer you reach equality. And the red is the 90s and the blue is the 70s. And you can see huge improvement. And in fact, if you looked at higher education today, the Catholics are more educated than the Protestants today. But one interesting thing is if you look at the police. Now, if you follow the Northern Irish story, you will know that that has been the outstanding thing which is holding up the whole negotiations. And if you look at this chart, you can see why, that they had not made any progress on the police, and they'd made progress everywhere else. And I feel that many people attribute the Northern Ireland peace process to individual actions by Gerry Adams, by Tony Blair, John Major, Clinton, Mitchell. And the untold story is this story of corrected inequalities, which I think made the whole thing possible. But again, Northern Ireland didn't do anything to integrate the communities, or very little, and the relationships in terms of respect for each other are not very good. Well, then there's an international dimension I don't want to talk about because it takes a long time, but I do think the same sort of argument can be applied to Islam versus the West and makes us understand much better some of the things that are going on. And it also applies within countries, that Islamic communities within European countries at least are discriminated against and poorer. So that really is basically what I wanted to say, that where there are large horizontal inequalities, it's important to address them, and that there is a range of policies possible, and that these policies are needed in any society with sharp divisions, not just those with recent conflict. And finally, I'm not saying this is the whole story of conflict, and it's certainly not the whole story of development, but it is one important part of the story. Thank you.